Friends, as I said, today we're celebrating the feast day of St. Vincent de Paul, which isn't a unique way, a particular feast for our parish, just because of our incredible St. Vincent de Paul ministry. I know many of us at Mass this morning have taken part in that ministry in one way or another, whether it was loading food in and out of the pantry or serving food to the folks as they come throughout the week. But man, we have an incredible treasure here at Sacred Heart with our St. Vincent de Paul ministry and the people who put that on. I was blessed a number of years ago. It was 2009. A buddy of mine who was a seminarian, now a priest at the time, Father Jeff Barnish, and two other priests, the four of us traveled to Rome, Assisi, and Paris. And part of the trip to Paris was making a stop to the tomb of St. Vincent de Paul. I didn't know this at the time, but Vincent de Paul is incorrupt. He's an incorrupt saint. And he is really incorrupt. Looks like he's just napping, kind of incorrupt. And his body is in this glass case that's just above, so it's hard to picture, but imagine there's a second level up here, and there's stairs that lead up on either side behind the high altar, and you can go and kneel right in front of the glass case. And I was doing that. I was kneeling right in front of this glass case, and I'm like this close to the guy's face. I'm like, you can count his eyelashes. It's crazy. It's just crazy. Anyway, it's a sign from God. Why would God do those sorts of things? It's certainly a sign that this person lived an incredibly heroic life, and his care and concern for the poor is meant to be modeled by all of us. So that's St. Vincent de Paul. I want to turn our attention, though, back to the first reading, this kind of continuation of the journey through the book of Ezra, because there's some just beauty in this first reading. I love this first reading that we have today, this segment from the book of Ezra, that he is just so overwhelmed with gratitude in this reading. He is so overwhelmed with gratitude, he can barely speak, or he can barely contain himself. He can't sleep. He's just thinking about the justice of God in punishing the people of Israel and sending them into exile. And then he says, but a short time, mercy came to us from the Lord. This unbelievable turn of events, right? A short time ago, mercy came to us from the Lord our God, who left us a remnant and gave us a stake in his holy place. Thus our God has brightened our eyes and given us relief in our servitude. For slaves we are, but in our servitude our God has not abandoned us. Rather, he has turned the goodwill of the kings of Persia toward us. Again, the astonishment that God has used the enemies of Israel to bring about the goodness of Israel. Thus he has given us new life to raise again the house of our God and to restore its ruins, and has granted us a fence in Judah and Jerusalem. This utterly unforeseen, this unimaginable turn of events towards the good. Who could have imagined that the kings of Persia would be the cause of Israel's restoration? What I'm trying to get at is this unimaginable turn towards the good, this experience of Israel in the Old Testament here, it's a foreshadowing of the resurrection. You've heard me preach about typology, how things in the Old Testament point towards things in the New Testament, right? The old prefigures the new fulfills the old. This restoration, this return from exile, is a type of the resurrection. The resurrection was utterly unforeseen, unimaginable, right? You go from utter calamity, chaos, devastation, loss. In Good Friday, he's dead, he's buried. They wrap his body 100 pounds of aloes and spices. You don't do that if you think the guy's coming back, right? You're going to say, let's save the aloes and spices. I think he's coming back. You wouldn't waste it on a corpse that's coming back. And they mourn because they think that's the end of the story, but he comes back. The resurrection was not the logical conclusion of a process. It wasn't as though, we know suffering, death, and resurrection as a sequence in our minds. That was not a sequence in the minds of Jesus' followers. It was suffering and death, period. Right? It's not like the resurrection was the emergence of the butterfly from the chrysalis, right? The caterpillar goes into the cocoon, breaks down, and then emerges as this butterfly. The emergence of the Christ from the tomb is not the emergence of the butterfly. That is a logical conclusion that you can understand. This is an utterly unimaginable turn towards the good. There's a phrase that a buddy of mine who's now a priest, but in seminary, he shared this word with me, and I've not stopped thinking about it since. To describe the resurrection, it's a word that J.R.R. Tolkien coined. Tolkien, of course, who's the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He said we have in English the word catastrophe to describe this sudden devastation turned towards the bad. He said we don't have in English its opposite. A sudden turn towards the good from calamity. So he said, I'm going to coin the phrase Eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe. This is what he said in his essay he wrote called On Fairy Tales. I coined the word Eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears, which I argued is the highest function of any fairy stories to produce. And I was there led to the view that it produces its peculiar effect in us because it is a sudden glimpse of the truth. That your whole nature is chained in material cause and effect, the chain of death. It feels a sudden relief as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. It perceives, if the story has literary truth on this level, that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made. And I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe possible in the greatest fairy story, and produces that essential emotion, Christian joy, which produces tears because it is qualitatively so like sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled, as selfishness and altruism are lost in love. So friends, on this feast of St. Vincent de Paul, we're reminded again of the great eucatastrophe of the resurrection that we consume in this Eucharist.